flatbed pulled up at 6:47 in the morning. No call ahead. No paperwork beyond a handwritten slip. 5 units. Dead stock. Disposal authorized. Sign here. Drew Callahan read it. At the bottom, M. Voss, COO. Voss Meridian Automotive. He watched them lower all 5 crates into his gravel lot. Said nothing. Signed. 3 weeks later, a lawyer knocked on the garage door, set a check for $2 million on the workbench and said, Ms. Voss would like her engines back. Drew looked at the check, then looked up slowly. She should have asked before she threw them away. He hadn't planned to open them that first morning. The flatbed was already gone by the time Drew finished his coffee, and the 5 wooden crates sat in the gravel, like something the tide had left behind. He'd seen disposal drops before engine blocks too seized to rebuild, transmissions missing half their guts. Usually he'd crack them open, pull whatever was salvageable, sell the cores for scrap. Routine. He started with the second crate from the left. The lid came off clean. He reached in, got his hands around the engine block, and stopped. Cast aluminum. Precision milled. He could feel the CNC work in the surface before he even looked at it. The tolerances too fine, the finish too consistent for anything that belonged in a salvage drop. He tilted the block toward the bay door light and ran his thumb along the intake manifold. The machining pattern was specific, not just familiar in a general way. Familiar the way your own handwriting is familiar, the particular weight of a decision made years ago, rendered in metal. He set the block down slowly. He opened all 5 crates before he did anything else. Each one the same. Matched serials, matched spec, 5 units from the same production run the same run that had never gone into production. He stood there in the October light, surrounded by 5 engines that had no business being here, and he listened to Harwick waking up around him. A dog somewhere on Milner Street. The freight train running the Eastern Line at 7:30. The gas station 2 blocks over flipping its sign. He didn't call anyone. He got the hand truck, loaded each crate one at a time, wheeled them into the back of the shop. He pulled the tarp from the stack against the wall, covered all 5, locked the interior door. Not because he was hiding them, because he needed time to understand what it meant that they were here. Around noon, Colt came back from school the way he always did, backpack half unzipped, shoes loud on the concrete, and climbed up onto the hood of the '73 Camaro Drew kept in the corner for parts. The kid ate his sandwich up there, legs dangling, watching his father work on a customer's F-150. "You find something today?" Colt asked. Drew didn't look up from the wheel bearing he was pressing. Something somebody didn't want anymore. Colt chewed and considered this with the patience of a 9-year-old who understood that some answers were complete and some were doors. Like the snowblower Mrs. Parrish left at the curb, bigger than that. The boy accepted this and finished his sandwich. That evening, after Colt was inside doing homework and the shop had gone quiet, Drew sat at the workbench and called a number he hadn't called in 4 years. He didn't explain much. He read the serial number off the plate on the first engine block, 22 digits, manufacturer prefix and all. There was a pause on the other end. Not a long one, just the kind that happens when someone recognizes a thing, then a name. Said quietly, "The way you say the name of something you thought was gone." Drew put the phone on the bench. He looked out the small window above the pegboard. The lot was dark by then. The street light on the corner caught the edge of the tarp. He didn't call back. Didn't call anyone else. He sat there for a long time, the masking tape with the serial number stuck to the desk in front of him, the name still sitting in the silence of the shop. The kitchen light in the house next door had been off for 2 hours when Drew finally opened the laptop. He'd been at the workbench with a cold cup of coffee and the serial number written on a strip of masking tape. Colt was asleep. The compressor had finished its last cycle. The shop was the particular quiet of a place that's been full of noise all day and remembers it. He typed the serial prefix into a database. He still had credentials for a private engineering archive he'd helped build during the years when he and Marcus Reed had believed they were going to change how compact EV powertrains got made in America. He hadn't logged in since the company sold. He'd assumed access would be revoked. It hadn't been. The search returned one result: Project Halverson. Initiated January 2019. Lead engineer, Andrew J. Callahan. Status: IP transferred. Physical assets in long-term storage. Commercial production suspended indefinitely. He read it twice, He and Reed had spent 18 months on the Halverson powertrain, designed it from the intake manifold to the output shaft, a compact EV drive unit that ran cooler, lighter, and more efficiently than anything else at that price tier. They'd built 7 prototypes. 5 had been shipped to a client for evaluation. The client had never placed a production order. Then the acquisition happened. A larger automotive group bought Callahan, Reed Propulsion, folded the IP into their holdings, and let the whole project sit. By then, Drew's wife had been gone for 3 months. He hadn't fought the acquisition. He hadn't fought anything. He'd signed what his lawyer put in front of him, taken the buyout, and driven home to Harwick to raise a 7-year-old and figure out what kind of a life was still possible after the kind of loss that doesn't have a shape. He opened the garage 2 months later. Not because it was a plan. Because he knew engines, and engines didn't ask him how he was doing. He looked at the masking tape, then back at the screen. 5 units for client evaluation. 5 units under a tarp in his back room. Whoever had ordered that flatbed drop had no idea that the man who signed for the crates was the same man who had designed them. He looked at the authorization slip on the corner of the bench. M. Voss, COO, Voss Meridian Automotive. He didn't know that name, didn't know what Voss Meridian was, or how they'd ended up holding his work. What he knew was simpler, and also more complicated. Disposal authorization was a legal transfer. The engines had been released. He'd received them. They were his. He thought about calling a lawyer. Thought about calling Voss Meridian directly. He could do a dozen things that would set something in motion. Instead, he closed the laptop, got the toolbox from under the bench, and walked back to the crates. He pulled the tarp off the first one. He'd missed these. He hadn't let himself know that until he was standing here now with the tools in his hand, the specific weight of the block, the sound the valve cover made when it came loose, the smell of the seals still faintly present after 5 years in storage. All of it still here. He stood there for a moment and let that settle. He and his wife had stood in a garage not unlike this one, the year before she died, looking at an early Halverson prototype and talking about what they would name the company. She'd wanted something geographic. He'd wanted something technical. They'd argued about it with the pleasant ease of 2 people who both know the argument doesn't actually matter. They'd never settled it. He picked up the first seal. He started with the small work, the stuff that didn't require decisions, just hands and attention. He worked until midnight. He didn't rush anything. Mara Voss found out about the Halverson gap on a Tuesday, the way she found out about most problems, through a document that should have reached her months ago and hadn't. Ruth Okafor was the one who brought it in. Ruth was 62, had been with the company since before Mara's tenure, and had a face that kept its own counsel. She set the internal audit file on Mara's desk without comment and waited. The EV division was heading into its quarterly review. Board members were asking questions. And somewhere in the physical asset ledger, 5 prototype units under the Halverson designation had been logged as present in storage as recently as last year, but were nowhere in the current inventory. Mara read through the file twice. Then she called Gerald Fitch. Fitch was the company's CFO 55, well-connected, with the particular ease of a man who had been in the same organization long enough to have stopped distinguishing between institutional authority and personal authority. He answered on the second ring. The Halverson units, Mara said, already handled. His voice was smooth. Proper disposal. Nothing to worry about. I'm looking at an inventory gap. Obsolete prototypes. No commercial value. Standard write-off. I need the documentation. A pause. Brief. I'll have my assistant send it over. The paperwork arrived 2 hours later, a single-page internal memo authorizing disposal, signed by Fitch, and a line item noting the units had been transferred via contracted carrier. No destination address, no receiving party, no confirmation of receipt. Mara spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with the transport company. It took 3 calls and a conversation with the dispatch supervisor to get the final delivery address, Callahan Auto and Salvage, Harwick, Ohio. She didn't tell Fitch she'd found it. She didn't tell Ruth either. She closed her office door, stood at the window for a minute looking out at the Columbus skyline, then picked up her keys. She drove to Harwick that same afternoon without telling anyone where she was going. The garage was on the main street hand-painted sign, 2 bay doors open, gravel lot. She parked and walked in. The place smelled like oil and metal, and something older she couldn't name, a mineral quality that felt like the inside of the earth. "Hello?" A pair of legs extended from under the front end of a pickup truck. Everything above the knees was invisible. "Give me a minute." She waited, looked around the shop. It was organized in a way that took a second to read not the chaos it first appeared, but everything in specific relation to everything else. Tools hung by size and type, parts labeled in black marker on masking tape. The man rolled out from under the truck on a creeper board and stood. He was taller than she'd expected. Oil on his forearms, on the knees of his jeans. He picked up a rag from the bench and looked at her without particular expression. "I'm Mara Voss, COO of Voss Meridian Automotive. We delivered 5 engine units to this location approximately 3 weeks ago. I need to arrange for their return." He wiped his hands. "You authorized the disposal. I'm aware of that. Then you know I have valid transfer documentation. Those units are company property." He looked at her steadily. "I have a signed disposal form from your office. That makes them mine. I'd like to discuss a return arrangement. I'm in the middle of something right now." He went back to the truck. She stood there another moment, then walked back to her car. She returned 3 days later with a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Cole Dinnick Corporate. Expensive, with the precise diction of someone who had learned that confidence sounds like authority. He laid out the offer on the workbench, while Drew stood with his arms crossed and listened without expression. $80,000, described as fair market value for salvaged prototype units in non-operational condition. Drew looked at the number on the paper. "No, that figure is negotiable," Dinnick said. "We're authorized to go meaningfully higher. It's not about the number." Dinnick adjusted his approach. He explained the company's legal position with care, the original asset classification, the administrative authority behind the disposal order, the difficulty of maintaining an ownership claim against a well-resourced corporate entity in a county court. He used the phrase contested disposal twice. He was professional and methodical, and it accomplished nothing. Drew picked up a socket wrench from the bench and turned back toward the engine he'd been working on. He didn't look up again. Dinnick tried 2 more approaches. Drew answered one of them, briefly, without stopping what he was doing. The other he let sit. Back in the parking lot, Dinnick told Mara they had other options available. He had a contact in the county commissioner's office, someone who had done favors for the parent group before. Small towns had pressure points. Licensing inspections could be scheduled. Zoning questions could be raised. There were ways to make holding contested property more trouble than it was worth, and they didn't have to be heavy-handed about it. Mara listened to all of it, then said, "No, we handle this cleanly." He looked at her the way experienced lawyers look at clients who are creating complications for themselves. "The board wants those units back before the audit window closes. That's a hard deadline." "I know what the deadline is." She got in the car. She spent the next 2 days sitting with the refusal and not being able to explain it. She went through everything available on Callahan Auto and Salvage, a business license dating back 11 years, a handful of local reviews, a paragraph in a Harwick Register feature on small shops surviving the post-manufacturing economy. One review mentioned that Drew Callahan was thorough and didn't oversell. Another said he'd told someone their transmission wasn't worth rebuilding when he could have charged them to do it anyway. None of it explained why a man working in a 2-bay garage would decline $80,000 without even asking for more. The particular quality of the refusal bothered her, not the refusal itself, the way he'd said it. It's not about the number, not angry, not calculating, just flat and certain. The way you state a fact about the physical world. On the 3rd afternoon, she drove back alone. No folder, no prepared position, no Dinnick. She found Drew in the lot, replacing brake pads on an Equinox, the old pads and the caliper bracket laid out on the ground beside him in a specific order. She waited until he set down what he was holding and looked up. "What do you actually want?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment differently than the first 2 times, not assessing. "Something else. I want to know why you threw them away," he said. She didn't have an answer, not one that was honest and complete, and didn't require admitting that she had signed something she hadn't understood because she had trusted a process she hadn't examined. She was still thinking about it when she got back in her car. She came back the next afternoon, not with a new offer, because the question he'd asked was still sitting somewhere she couldn't move it from, and she'd spent most of the night recognizing that she didn't actually know the answer, and that not knowing was different from not having one. She'd been treating this entire situation as a negotiation problem when he'd been asking her something different from the start. He was in the back of the shop when she arrived, tarp partially off the first crate, valve cover removed, running a diagnostic tool along the wiring harness, with the focused attention of someone who has done this particular job many times and is still engaged with it. She stood in the doorway. Gerald Fitch told me they were obsolete, that they had no commercial application, and that keeping them in storage was a liability. He had a write-off memo and a 2-page technical assessment. Drew moved the probe to a different contact point. And you signed. He's the CFO. I had no reason to question the assessment. Did you read it? A pause. Long enough to answer the question before she did. I read the executive summary. He didn't respond to that directly. Just moved the probe again, made a note on the pad beside the crate. I'm not here to make another offer, she said. I'm telling you I didn't know what those engines were. I signed the authorization because I trusted the process, and the process failed because someone had already corrupted it. That's on the company. That's partly on me. I'm not going to position my way around that. He set the probe down. He looked at her across the engine block, and the fluorescent light above them hummed faintly, at a frequency you could only hear when everything else had gone quiet. Have you ever actually looked inside one of them? He asked. No. He stood there for a moment, as if taking something in. Then he stepped back from the crate and tilted his head toward it. She walked in. He lifted the valve cover off the second unit and angled the work light down into the block. She leaned over it. She had an MBA and 14 years in automotive corporate strategy. She could read a supply chain report or a market analysis and pull out the 6 numbers that actually mattered. But she was not an engineer and had never claimed to be. What she understood about engines was functional, not structural, what they cost to source, how they fit into a production timeline, what they returned per unit at different price tiers. What she was looking at now was structural, and even without the technical vocabulary to name what she was seeing, she could tell it was precise in a way that went beyond ordinary precision. The port geometry, the wiring harness bundled and routed with a deliberateness that felt intentional rather than efficient, the intake manifold, where it seated against the block, shaped like something that had been worked through over a long time and from multiple directions. What is this, specifically? She asked. Compact EV drive unit. He spoke without inflection, describing, not explaining. Peak efficiency in the 70 to 90 horsepower range. Thermal management built into the block rather than external. Output-to-weight ratio about 20% better than comparable production units. She looked at him. He was still looking at the engine. Fitch's assessment said no commercial value, she said. He didn't respond to that. She straightened. Something had changed in the space between them, not a warmth exactly, more like a different quality of attention. She left without making another offer. Neither of them said anything about it. That night, at 9:43, her phone rang. Ruth Okafor. I need to tell you something about Halverson. Not over email, not at the office. They met the following morning at a coffee shop 11 miles outside Columbus. Ruth's choice of location. Ruth set a manila folder on the table and left her hands flat on top of it. She looked at Mara for a moment before she opened it long enough to make clear this was something she'd been carrying. What I'm about to show you, I should have brought to you months ago. I was afraid to. I'm bringing it now because what Fitch is doing is going to become your problem eventually, and you deserve to see it before it gets there. Not after. He opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a patent filing from 2019, United States Patent and Trademark Office. Application number, filing date, international classification codes. At the top of the first page, under the heading Halverson Powertrain System, lead designer, Andrew J. Callahan. Mara read it twice. Read it a third time. Voss Meridian bought the manufacturing license, Ruth said, when the parent group acquired Callahan Reed Propulsion, not the underlying IP. The acquisition contract had a clause buried in Schedule 7 of the Asset Transfer Agreement that reverted the design IP back to the original inventors if the units weren't placed into commercial production within 5 years of the acquisition date. Mara looked up. 5 years. The acquisition closed in October of 2019. Commercial production was never initiated. The 5-year window closed last month. Ruth's voice was the voice of someone who has been managing her own fear long enough that the fear has smoothed down into something quiet and functional. The IP had already reverted to Callahan before the disposal happened. The engines weren't Voss Meridian property when the authorization was signed. Fitch knew, Mara said. He's known about Schedule 7 since the acquisition closed. He commissioned the technical assessment that called the units obsolete. That assessment was the justification for disposal, and it was written specifically to support a conclusion he'd already reached. He arranged the entire disposal through an informal channel, without general counsel review, without board notification, because he needed it done before anyone connected the physical assets to the reversion clause. Mara set the patent copy down on the table. She felt very calm. The particular calm that arrives when you have understood something completely, and the implications are still coming into focus. He was trying to destroy the physical evidence of a clause he'd hidden from the board. Yes, if the units no longer existed, there was no trail back to Schedule 7. No trail back to his having structured an acquisition with a time-limited IP provision he hadn't disclosed. He'd been sitting on this for 5 years. The reversion was the deadline. Mara sat with that. Outside the coffee shop window, a school bus moved through the intersection. She thought about the garage in Harwick, about a man who had looked at a serial number and stopped moving, about what that recognition must have felt like, coming out of nowhere on an October morning. "Don't tell anyone about this meeting," she said. "Not yet, not anyone." She left Ruth at the table, got back into her car, and sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She thought about what it meant that a man in a garage in Harwick had quietly signed for 5 engine crates and said nothing to anyone, not to a lawyer, not to the press, not to Voss Meridian, and had simply started working on them. Someone who recognized something and wanted to be near it again. Then she drove to Harwick. It was dark by the time she got there, past 9. The garage sat on its corner with a light on inside and a radio going low. She knocked. Drew opened the door. He looked at her face and said nothing. Just stepped back and opened the door wider. She went in. She told him everything. She stood by the workbench in the shop's fluorescent quiet and laid it out in the order it had happened. The patent filing, the acquisition clause, the 5-year reversion window, Fitch's assessment, the disposal arrangement, the timeline that made clear. None of it had been accidental. She didn't soften it, didn't position herself, just said what Ruth had shown her and let it sit where it landed. Drew listened with his arms at his sides and his weight even on both feet. He didn't shift or look away or ask questions. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Is Ruth safe?" The question stopped her. "What do you mean? If Fitch figures out she talked to you, is there anything that comes back on her?" She looked at him. That was not the first question she would have expected from most people in his situation. Most people would have asked about the IP, or the legal standing, or the money. "I'll protect her. I have enough standing at the board level to do that." He nodded. He moved to the far side of the bench and stood there with his hands resting on the edge of it, looking at a point in the middle distance that had nothing to do with the shop. After a moment he said, "I designed those engines with my wife." He said it the way you state a fact that has been true for a long time without announcement, without the particular weight of someone building towards something. He was just locating the information, placing it in the room so the other person could find it. "We had a plan. After Halverson, after the client evaluation came back, we were going to buy out Reed's share of the company and build something smaller, something we controlled. She had the business sense. I had the technical side. We'd been working on the plan for 2 years. He paused. She died before the evaluation even finished. Car accident, December 2019. Mara said nothing. The specific quality of nothing that means, I understand that there isn't anything to say. After the acquisition, I signed what they put in front of me. I didn't read Schedule 7. I didn't read any of the schedules. I just wanted to be done with it and go home. He looked toward the back room, toward the tarps. I thought the engines were gone. I assumed they'd either get produced eventually or disappear quietly, and that would be the last of it. And then they showed up in your lot, she said, and then they showed up in my lot. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't take them because of the IP. I didn't know about the reversion clause. I didn't know about any of it. I took them because I opened the first crate and put my hands on the block and recognized them. and that felt like something I thought had gone. Still being there. He stopped. It was the first time in 4 years something felt like it still existed, he said. That's the whole of it. The shop was very quiet. The radio had gone off at some point without either of them noticing, and the only sound now was the compressor maintaining pressure somewhere in the back. She looked at the tarps through the doorway of the back room. After a while she asked, "What are you going to do with them?" He looked at the back room, too. "I haven't decided yet." It was the first time she'd heard anything uncertain in his voice. Not evasion, not strategy. Just a man who didn't yet know the answer to a question that mattered. She didn't push it. The injunction notice was filed with Hardwick County Court on a Thursday morning. By 11 o'clock, Drew had it on his phone, an emergency motion filed by outside counsel on behalf of Voss Meridian Automotive, seeking a temporary freeze on the 5 Halverson units pending resolution of a contested ownership claim. The motion described Drew as a third party in unlawful possession of proprietary corporate assets. He put the phone in his pocket and kept working on the Silverado he had up on the lift. Fitch had moved fast. He'd found out about Mara's meeting with Ruth. Neither of them knew how, exactly, but the mechanics of a CFO with 30 years in the same organization weren't hard to imagine. He'd filed before Mara could take any official action, using outside attorneys rather than company counsel. He was running his own track. The same afternoon, the Harwick Register ran 3 paragraphs on its website. A local mechanic allegedly retaining company equipment following a disputed disposal. The language was careful enough to be technically accurate while producing a particular impression. People in Harwick talked. That was the point. Mara drove down as soon as she saw the filing. She found Drew in the bay, doing an oil change on a minivan that needed to be back by 5 o'clock for a woman who drove an hour each way to work in Zanesville. He finished draining the oil, set the pan aside, and looked at her. "You didn't file this." "No, Fitch did. He found out about Ruth, and he's trying to get in front of it before you can move officially." "Yes. If the board sees active litigation, they'll route everything through corporate channels, which he controls." He reached for a new filter. "I'm not worried about it." "You should be somewhat worried," she said. "He has resources, and he has time. He doesn't have the patent." He threaded the filter on. "I have the original filing, the assignment clause, and a disposal authorization with your signature. Fitch has a legal theory that doesn't survive Schedule 7 and a newspaper article." She watched him work. There was a quality to the way he moved through the job, methodical, untroubled, that made her feel, against all reason, slightly less alarmed than she had been on the drive down. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't offer to help. When the minivan's owner came to pick it up at 5 past 5, apologizing for being late, Drew handed her the keys and told her the wipers were starting to streak and she should replace them before winter. Mara left a few minutes after that. She drove back toward Columbus at the edge of rush hour, the highway slow and orange-lit, and thought about the fact that he had gone straight back to the oil change after she'd left. The conversation had cost him nothing in the way of visible composure. She wasn't sure if that was reassuring or the most unsettling thing she'd encountered in this entire situation. That evening, Drew found a number for Della Marsh, the IP attorney, who had represented Callahan Reed Propulsion during its formation and knew the Halverson documentation better than anyone except the engineers who'd produced it. He hadn't spoken to her in 5 years. She picked up on the third ring. He described what he had: the patent, the reversion clause, the disposal authorization. What Fitch had filed that morning. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Drew, if Schedule 7 says what you're describing, this isn't a difficult case. How soon can you be in Harwick?" "Friday. Bring everything." He thanked her and hung up. Outside, the lot was dark. The street light on the corner threw its usual square of orange across the gravel. Somewhere down Milner Street, the dog was barking at something it would never catch. He went back inside the shop. The hearing was held on a Monday at the Harwick County Courthouse on Clement Street, a brick building that also housed the county assessor's office, and on the second floor, a branch of the public library. Della Marsh had arrived Friday and spent the weekend at the workbench table in Drew's shop, with the full documentation spread out in front of her. She was 53, deliberate, and had once told Drew that patent law was mostly about documentation and patience, and that the people who won were usually the ones who had kept better records than the other side. Drew had kept everything: the original Halverson patent filing, certified copies from the USPTO, the Callahan-Reed acquisition agreement in its entirety, 412 pages, Schedule 7 included, with the reversion clause marked on page 281, a production activity log covering the 5 years from acquisition close to the present, documenting no commercial output. The disposal authorization form bearing Mara Voss's signature, dated 3 weeks prior to the filing, after the reversion had already triggered. Monday morning, Fitch's attorneys led with corporate authority. The acquisition had transferred all Halverson-related assets. The disposal had been a standard administrative action. The receiving party had no claim superior to the company's original ownership position. Della responded with Schedule 7. She read the reversion clause aloud, in full, without comment. She placed the acquisition date and the production record into a single chronological timeline. She noted that the 5-year window had closed before the disposal occurred, which meant the design IP had reverted to Andrew J. Callahan before the authorization was signed. The engines transferred under a disposal authorization that Voss Meridian no longer had the legal standing to issue because the underlying IP no longer belonged to them at the time of signing. The judge asked Fitch's attorneys to address the timeline. They did not address it well. She asked whether the company's general counsel had reviewed the disposal documentation prior to the transfer. They had not. The injunction was denied. The judge found no legal basis to freeze assets received by an individual with superior IP standing under a properly executed reversion clause and a valid transfer document. The ruling was brief. It didn't need to be long. 2 days later, the Voss Meridian board convened without Fitch in attendance. The board authorized Mara to negotiate directly with Andrew Callahan, without routing anything through the CFO's office. She drove to Harwick on a Wednesday afternoon. The garage was open. Drew was at the bench with a carburetor from a 1988 Silverado, the kind of work that required attention but left room for thinking. He heard her car on the gravel and came to the bay door. She set the check on the workbench. $2 million. Beside it, a licensing term sheet. Manufacturing rights for the Halverson powertrain, 10-year term, royalty provisions on every commercial unit produced. You'd keep the patent, she said. The engines stay with you. We're paying for the right to manufacture. He read through the term sheet. All of it. He took his time. Then he picked up the pen and signed. They stood on either side of the bench for a moment, with the executed sheet between them. Fitch? He asked. Board opened an investigation Monday morning. He was out by Friday. He nodded once. Set the pen down. Gerald Fitch had arranged for 5 engines to disappear. Instead, he had sent them to the one person alive who understood exactly what they were worth. The sign out front still said Callahan Auto and Salvage. Drew didn't change it. Didn't hire anyone new. Didn't expand into the building next door that had been vacant since spring. He used part of the first licensing payment to settle a business loan he'd been carrying for 3 years, set up a college fund for Colt, and bought a new lift for the second bay, the kind that didn't stick when it was cold. The garage was still the garage. About a month after the hearing, Mara came back with the final executed copies of the licensing agreement. She parked on the gravel and walked in. Colt was in the shop. He'd come straight from school and was sitting on top of an old small block Drew kept around for teaching, eating a granola bar, reading something on a tablet. He looked up when she came in. "Hi," he said. "Hi." He looked at her with the direct curiosity of a 9-year-old who hadn't learned yet to soften the way he examined things. "Do you know why pistons have rings?" She stopped. "I don't, actually. I forgot part of the reason. I've been working it out." He tilted his head. "You want to hear what I've got so far?" She sat down on the stool beside the engine block. "Yeah, tell me." He told her with the uneven confidence of someone working at the edge of what they know, filling the gaps with reasoning rather than guessing. She asked 2 questions, both genuine. He answered one correctly and revised the other when she pointed out a gap in the logic, which he accepted without complaint. Drew came in from the back lot as Colt was finishing. He stood in the doorway and watched his son explain the function of piston ring gap to a woman in a good coat, sitting on a shop stool with her elbows on her knees, genuinely paying attention. He didn't say anything. After a while, Colt got interested in the tablet again. Mara stood up, handed Drew the envelope. He set it on the bench. "Thank you," she said. It covered more than the paperwork, and they both knew it. He nodded. She picked up her bag and walked toward the bay door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned. "Do you ever think about going back? Engineering? The other side of it?" He looked out at the lot. The sky was the flat gray of late November, the kind that sits low and doesn't move. Then he looked toward Colt, who had set the tablet down and was examining the brake caliper on a parts bicycle with the focused attention of someone who has recently learned something and is trying to use it. Then he looked at her. "I'm doing exactly what I want to do," he said. She held that for a second, nodded. She walked out. He heard her car start on the gravel, pull onto the street, and fade toward the interstate. In the shop, Colt asked the caliper a question under his breath, and then answered it himself. Drew went back to work. Harwick was still Harwick, same freight train on the Eastern Line, same dog on Milner Street, same gas station sign flipping in the cold. The engine sat in the back room under clean tarps, waiting for the engineering team Mara would send in the spring. They would get there eventually. And whatever had started between two people who began as a transaction and became something neither of them had a name for, yet it didn't need one. Some things are allowed to take their time.